Hey everybody, it's Erik, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with a very special guest, Andy Matuschak. Andy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a great time to be here.
So Andy, we're going to spend the next hour talking about your work. But Andy, when people ask you what your mission in life is or what you're most focused on right now or the goal of your work is, how do you sort of crystallize it into a minute or two in terms of what you're really trying to do?
I try to make tools to expand what people can think and do.
When you think about the core problem that you are trying to solve, it's that learning kind of sucks right now or that we're not learning optimally, or what is the problem you're addressing?
Well, first off, you can think about it as a problem in a negative sense or like an opportunity in a positive sense. It's some kind of strange four-dimensional crystal. You know, one piece of that is kind of like learning stuff's kind of hard. Does it need to be that way? Or maybe the flip side of that, the opportunity-wise, is like, what's the closest we can get to kind of I know Kung Fu style Matrix kind of visions? But I don't know, like you kind of rotate that crystal 30 degrees and it looks something like knowledge workers are surprisingly bad at knowledge work and don't really seem to know it. I use bad in kind of a loose sense here, but if you compare, for instance, the seriousness of their practices to those of 99th percentile athletes or musicians or something, it's really interesting how casually they treat their practice, myself included. That's fascinating. Activities like note-taking, for instance, are completely folksy and ad hoc and unsystematized, and no one really has like a clear sense of what it means to like accrete insight.
Yeah. So paint a little bit of your utopia, or if you achieve your mission, how will the world be different?
Sure. Well, a little while back, the Falcon Heavy had its first launch, and when it was on its way back down, it managed to do this kind of synchronized pirouette landing of two boosters at once, coming down and landing perfectly, and the feed, of course, showing the split screen, and they landed at the same time and stayed standing. And I was sitting on a park bench at the time watching this during my lunch, and I stood up and started cheering and screaming to no one in particular. It was totally involuntary. I want the world to have more moments like that. So there may be moments of achievement, they may be moments of aesthetic actualization, maybe as you experience, moments of profound beauty, moments of discovery, whatever it is that makes us more ourselves, that fills us with wonder and joy. Let's have more of that.
Yeah. And so what are some bottlenecks that are preventing that, or what would unleash some of those bottlenecks?
Well, thinking is really surprisingly hard. And even people who are maybe ostensibly pretty serious about thinking don't necessarily seem to have a great idea about exactly how that happens. People who come up with very surprising or innovative ideas, how exactly does that happen? Well, it seems like a bolt out of the blue. Like, what is the process? What are the prerequisites? What things come up? You'll see countless biographies and memoirs that have kind of notions of that. We don't really know. But it's something like, we try to do some good work, we read some things, we write some things, and then something wonderful happens. We try to do some art every day, and maybe we create something incredible. Can we do better than that? I don't know, but I'm really interested in the question and trying to create environments which, maybe don't guarantee success, but make it a little bit more likely. I'm very inspired by past environments of what Brian Eno calls scenius. Yeah. These places where it's not so much that there's like an individual genius doing something as much as, my goodness, there's something in that environment, whether there's an idea that suddenly unlocks a bunch of doors, or maybe it's just a contrary idea that helps people think in a new way, or there's some kind of social action. Think about the Bauhaus, or playing in Copenhagen in the early 20th century for physics or something like this. Can we create these environments more consistently? For San Francisco, it's interesting the degree to which less wrong has been that kind of environment, at least maybe 8 years ago for a bunch of people. Yeah.
And what do we not fully appreciate about genius as it relates to individual genius, or not fully understand, or misinterpret, and how should we think about going forward in terms of, real world genius versus online genius?
That's a great question. Honestly, I don't fully know the answer. I can kind of suggest few points that seem promising or interesting. I think one of them that seems interesting is that we just have no idea. Certainly sociologists have a bunch to say about it, but you'll find kind of contrary advice as much as you find accord. There's kind of obvious things you might want to avoid in an environment that's trying to produce genius. But I mean, just for a completely different example, it doesn't even necessarily have to be social. In some sense, if you consider someone trying to be a filmmaker or trying to make, say, a really challenging film from an editorial perspective, something like Memento, you imagine them doing it in the world where we don't have nonlinear video editors, and in the world where we do. I don't know, the likelihood that any individual comes upon that film seems very different in those two scenarios. And one of the ways in which those environments are different is the nature of the fundamental objects and actions that exist in those things. What are the nouns and verbs? Kind of prior to a nonlinear video editor, the verb might look something like splicing film with like a literal razor and some tape. And then afterwards, because the verb is a little bit more like maybe it's dragging or scrubbing or something like this, now it's a continuous action. And the impact of your action is sort of a real-time experiment instead of a plan and cut kind of experiment, which produces a totally different kind of a creative relationship.
You published an essay recently called "Why Books Don't Work." Can you explain the core of why they don't work and the idea of transmissionism that you mentioned in the essay?
I suppose first I should caveat that perhaps books and work should have asterisks next to them. The piece specifically concerns informational texts, and by work, I specifically mean to absorb knowledge. Or to walk away from that book with knowledge. So with that out of the way, I guess I'll just observe that the trade-off between the time one spends reading, well, we're in a VC context, so I'll just poke fun, Sapiens, say, and the amount of insight or knowledge that one durably walks away from that book with, that trade-off looks very strange. It makes sense in the context of, say, entertainment. Sure, it's a fun book to read. Maybe the prose is appealing. It tickles your intellect to engage with. So like that's all great, but also it maybe takes you 12 or 15 hours or something. And I think a lot of people read, at least with the sub rasa intention, that, there's a bunch of important ideas in this book and I want to engage with those ideas. And I think those ideas might like influence the way that I think about society or invention, or, maybe if I'm trying to be an inventor or an innovator or something, it might influence what I pursue next. And I think they mostly just kind of don't. When I talk to people who read informational texts, it's very common that they remember basically nothing of what they've read. They can kind of give the blurb on the cover and they can't really go into any depth at all. And sometimes that's kind of what they intend, but other times it's totally not. Like, they got really interested in X and they went down a whole big Wikipedia rabbit hole, and I'll say like, wow, that's so interesting. Like, tell me about X. And it's like, and until that moment, they really thought that they had like learned a bunch about X during that rabbit hole dive. And like, actually they didn't. And it's that scenario that seems jarring. If it's like, well, you went down the rabbit hole because it was fun, and you didn't walk away with anything like that, that's totally fine. But, the strange part is going down the rabbit hole, believing that you've somehow like made some increment or like you've built something durable. And then it's suddenly like a cloud, like you try to put your weight on it. It says, my goodness, that didn't work.
So why does that happen? Why do we not understand it, or why are we not able to reproduce it? And why do we think that we can?
Yeah, you asked earlier about this term transmissionism, and that's where this one comes in. So there's this kind of straw man idea in learning science that no one really believes anymore, but it's kind of implicitly what people acted on for a long time, which is, if you imagine kind of a very old school classroom with a teacher kind of hectoring a bunch of kids, the notion is kind of like they just need to sit and pay attention. They need to listen, and the teacher's words will fill their ears. And it is as if they are an empty vessel, which is being filled with knowledge as the teacher's voice passes over them. And if they failed to absorb some of that knowledge, that was their problem. They were, say, distracted looking out the window, not really paying attention. All they needed to do was like have the teacher's words pass over them. We don't believe that in a classroom setting. And yet it's like kind of the model that most people typically use when they're reading books. Certainly, some people read books with all kinds of additional engagement. They might write summaries or engage in reading discussion groups. And that's not really what I'm talking about. Instead, what I'm talking about is the notion of like, I'm going to sit on a bench and I'm going to like read each of the words. And then I'm going to have this expectation that those words are going to fill up the vessel of knowledge in my brain. That is the notion of transmissionism. And it's just kind of empirically not true.
Yeah. And so why do you think books have been remained the dominant medium for content absorption? Like, why haven't we figured this out, or why haven't we changed something?
Oh, okay, sure. Well, books are really great. I mean, to be clear, they're very cheap to print. If it's an ebook, it's basically free. Certainly, given prior materials that have existed until very recently, it's kind of the best technology available. Although, in many contexts, you see other forms being used. So, for instance, how does one get to be a scientist? It's not by reading books, it's by apprenticing yourself. How does one get to be an investment banker? I guess I don't really know. My understanding is that it looks kind of similar. How does one get to be a pro tennis player? It's not by reading books. In certain domains, we've kind of learned how to convey or absorb or build knowledge in other ways. And books are, I don't know, some kind of and here again, I'm talking about informational texts, some kind of lowest common denominator that we can fall back on when it's too expensive or too inconvenient or too unknown to do otherwise. But I think implicit in your question was maybe a wondering of like, okay, but like we've had computers for a while now, and it seems like computers solve a lot of problems, so like probably they should solve this problem too. And like, why hasn't that happened yet? Is that kind of what you're wondering? Okay, right. Well, I mean, why should we expect it to have happened? Like, what exactly is it about computers that we maybe expect might improve this situation? Like what comes to mind for you?
Well, sort of what you were doing with the quantum computing piece,
Okay, but that's cheating.
Yes. So I can't go back in time before I knew the answer. Which is also why I didn't learn that much in high school. Well, let me just ask you a question about books for a second. So some people have this thought that maybe nonfiction books could be a lot shorter, maybe 20 pages, 30 pages instead of 150, 200 or whatever. But some people think, no, there's something inherent about the process of reading 150, 200 pages, even if it's just repetition, that gets the mind working in an interesting way that articles or shorter form books could never do. Do you buy that?
Yeah, I think yes and more. And with some asterisks. So I'll try to unpack. We know very little about how memories are formed and how understanding happens. One thing that we do know is that repeated stimulus of a particular idea is a really good way to cause it to be encoded durably. And so if you read a long book about a topic, and despite its length, it is sufficiently engaging to actually get you to pay attention to it and think about it at least a little bit over many days, then you're going to have a much higher chance of successfully encoding that knowledge than if you had read an article in 15 minutes. But I think there's more than just recall. Like people want the takeaways, and sometimes that's all that's useful from someone's inquiry into a field. But often everything around that is as useful or more useful or is a prerequisite for doing anything with the takeaways. I'll try to describe how. For a lot of nonfiction, the resulting claims, in Sapiens, so many of those claims are not falsifiable. Yeah. And that's true even in books that seem less tenuous than that. And so really what the book represents is a way of seeing things and a way of thinking about things. And what you were reading through all of those pages is that mental model unwinding on a topic. And so what you walk away with maybe is a weak mental model of that person's process, even if we leave the takeaways aside. And then I made this other point that I don't know how true this is. There's some structural reason to believe it. There are all these aphorisms in business. Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm not a business person, so I'm going to be slow at coming up with great examples. But
you don't see yourself working with a person for the rest of your life, don't work with them for a day.
Sure. That's great. Let's roll with that. That's a takeaway. And like if I wrote a book about, I don't know, co-founder dynamics or something, and I had like multiple chapters on that idea, you might find yourself really wishing that I had just like given you that sentence. And yet at the same time, like that sentence is not a fundamental law. It's not a law of reality. It is a rule of thumb. It is a heuristic. So without the couple of chapters, and yeah, maybe they could be edited or whatever, but without the whole framework that gives rise to that intuition and that heuristic, it's not really a useful or applicable heuristic. I mean, maybe you can bootstrap yourself to some understanding by using it, but you don't have the network of ideas that was used to create the heuristic. And so it's just as likely to become what Catmull calls a briefcase handle, where it's as if you've gone to pick the briefcase full of ideas up from off the table, and you've just like walked off with the handle. And the rest of the briefcase is still sitting on a table. And sometimes you see a company where like the whole company is like people walking around like with just a briefcase handles. So that's the sense in which I guess I have some objection about everybody wishing things would be shorter. That said, a lot of books are simply not worth reading. And I think people often kind of torture themselves with some kind of sense of obligation, either to finish a book that they've started or to read something that people are talking about. One framing I often use when I'm kind of thinking about some new book that just came out and like people are talking about it, and I feel like some weird societal pressure to read it. It's like, there are still a couple of Milan Kundera novels that I haven't read. Yeah. And like, why would I read one of my favorite authors? Why would I read some new novel when there are still these things that have stood the test of time? They're incredible that I haven't read. I don't know.
Yeah. For the record, I thought the Book of Laughter and Forgetting was overrated. I think I read all of it. I only liked Unbearable Lightness of Being. So here's why I think computers should have changed books by now. Okay. I mean, we're social, so I should be able to see who's reading what I'm reading at the same time, what they think about it. I'd expect it to be annotated. By the author himself. I expect, new context to have emerged since the book was released. I'd expect to be able to, engage with it. I'd expect for it to sort of identify how much I'm retaining and then sort of evolve in real time based on that. And I'm just sort of riffing.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I love it. I find myself excited about lots of things in this domain. And I always have to kind of ask myself, like, great. Like, so what job is that doing exactly? So some of the things that you just mentioned, I think they're doing a very important job, which is to create a stronger emotional connection with the content. Something that Michael Nielsen and I have been thinking about a little bit is, film and video forms successfully create much stronger emotional connections for like a given level of engagement. And it's really powerful for a variety of reasons. And so, maybe if you knew that your buddies or a bunch of people you respected were reading something and kind of thinking seriously about it, that would make you feel more invested. You'd enjoy reading more, and that's valuable in itself. It might not help you understand more deeply. But if you really took to its conclusions, it could. So one of the more effective forms we've developed for really comprehending literature of all forms seriously are well-organized seminar discussions. They're fantastic when they're organized well, because they not only push you to synthesize, evaluate, compare, but also to engage with others' conceptions of what you had thought was the same thing. On a shallow level, that might look like debate, but I think it's actually much more interesting when it's not about debate as much as, wow, look at all of these different ways of seeing this, or look at all the different impacts this is having on people.
Yeah. So in the essay, you also talked about the concept of metacognition. Talk about what role that plays in learning, whether we can learn it, and how our reading tools can be designed to better produce it.
Mm-hmm. So a great entree to this topic might be some of the reading techniques that people already employ and employ really effectively. So people might highlight when they read. What's the purpose of doing that? Well, it kind of sharpens your attention. It kind of purports to make sure that you're not kind of just scanning over the words, but it's kind of in one ear and out the other, so to speak. It's trying to maybe make you do a certain kind of monitoring to decide what's important. Overall, that's a pretty weak technique. So we could kind of move up the stack, and we could do something like a sophisticated reader will ask themselves questions about what they've just read. They'd say like, how does that comport with the other writing I've read on this topic? Does it conflict in any way? What are those ways? What surprises me about that? What doors does it open up? And that's doing a whole bunch of interesting things. But one of the things it does, of course, is to check your understanding of the material, as well as to kind of reframe that material in your own ontology. A bunch of these activities, and I'll kind of summarize them as kind of monitoring your own activities, engaging in self-regulation, where a process that normally kind of runs itself, you're going to reach in and say like, oh, actually, no, I need to reread that section. And also all kinds of interesting executive control and functions. So if you're to read a book and it references a concept that you think you understand, but then you feel like there's some implication in the passage that like seems really important to the author and like it's just not hitting you, then that decision, first off, to notice that, and then second off, to decide, what am I going to do about that? Generate solutions. Well, I know I read, this other person talking about this, like, let me go check that out again. And then finally to like exert the executive control to say like, okay, so what that means is I'm going to stop doing this semi-automatic thing I was doing, which is like to read the words linearly on the page and turn those pages until I feel like getting up, and like put that book away and like get this other book. All of that is metacognition.
And let's get into the quantum computing piece you and Michael Nielsen worked on together. What were some of the problems you were trying to solve for, and what were some of the solves that you incorporated?
Sure. The fun thing about talking about this project is there's kind of like the ostensible research questions and things we didn't expect. And it pairs well with the metacognition and the metacognitive questions, actually. Okay, so really quickly, Quantum Country. Quantum Country is a weird kind of quantum computing textbook, question mark. It looks kind of like a e-textbook thing, I guess, except that every few minutes as you read, there are these little lightweight interactions, kind of swipey Tinder-like interactions where it's like, hey, so you just read a bunch of stuff about qubits. So if you were to represent a qubit as a vector, like how many dimensions would it be again? And like what kind of number are the numbers in that vector? And those are really simple declarative questions. But later on, we might ask things like, well, why might it not be a good idea to represent a qubit with this kind of matter? And these are not fill in the blank questions. These are not like multiple choice, choose, you get graded. It's not any of that. Instead, it's a 1 second interaction where you look at the question, you think about it, and then you just flick like, yeah, I remembered that, or I feel good about my internal answer. You just kind of think it to yourself. Or I didn't actually. No, I didn't. And that happens every few minutes as you read. So, the motivation there was getting back to these claims about books, where people don't seem to remember things. Boy, for a field that's already pretty hard, it seems extra bad if you don't remember things. And, quantum computing is this famously challenging field to learn. People make jokes about it. It's like, oh my gosh, if you think you understand, quantum mechanics, you really don't. So, what if one of the reasons for that is that these ideas, like ideas in many fields, are very tall in their dependency graph. So a given notion that you might be trying to learn on page 10, well, really, that depends on 3 notions from the last couple pages, each of which depend on like 4 or 5 notions from the previous few pages. So it's building up that notation and those definitions and those concepts really, really quickly, which means you can't have had time to put them in your long-term memory, which means you just read them, so they're in your working memory. And we know you can only juggle a few things in your working memory at once. So maybe the real reason that concept you're trying to learn feels so hard is that it's simply putting too many demands on your working memory. And it's not that quantum computing is like essentially hard in some insurmountable fashion. So the interactions with these interstitial questions that I mentioned, their role is to make memory a solved problem. They follow this interesting tradition that's been surprisingly successful at that somewhat pointed or stark aspiration. But anyway, so you answer these questions, and the way in which they make memory solve problem is that if you fail to remember the answer to one of the questions, then it will appear in the next little area, and so you'll get another chance to see it. And in fact, the next day, you'll get a little email saying like, "Hey, so you just spent like 4 hours reading this thing, so let's maybe not lose everything you just read. Let's spend just a couple of minutes, 4 or 5 minutes, and flick through those questions again." And it might feel pretty bad, like, oh gosh, how am I going to have to review these every day? Like, that seems pretty bad. But it turns out that once you have remembered the question in the essay, and then you kind of remembered it shortly thereafter in a little review session we sent you, now we can wait a while. Right now, what we're trying actually with the newest cohort is waiting 2 weeks. That's working pretty well too. So, read the essay, answer the question, you remember it, good. Like let's look at it again in 5 days. And again, this is a question you're going to spend maybe 2-3 seconds looking at. Cool, you remember it still? Okay, we're going to look at it again in 2 weeks. Remember it still? Okay, like let's go out to a month. So like your total contact time for a given question to achieve 1 month, and actually we have about 100 users who have achieved a bunch of 2-month demonstrated retention, is really quite small.
And what is it about the memory that makes it so that cramming doesn't work, but that this sort of phased out approach does?
Yeah, this is called the spacing effect. And I guess I could interpret your question physiologically. I don't know if that is known. So I could speculate, but that's probably not so helpful. So instead, I guess I'll just share that empirically, it is the case that if you have 10 minutes to spend studying a given thing, you are way better off spacing those 10 minutes out over some period of time. What the period is kind of depends empirically on what you're studying, but irrespective of what you choose there, it's better than if you do it all at once.
And are you of the school of thought that if you can't reproduce something, you don't really fully understand it? Or put differently, some people might define themselves by saying, hey, it's less about reproducing it and more about learning about this new way of thinking. I mean, some people say about fiction, right? It's sort of, I'm put in someone else's head, or certain types of nonfiction even make me think in certain ways, and it's less about reproducing it. Do you sympathize with that, or how do you respond to that?
Understanding is multifarious, and there's no simple answer to that question. I think it really depends on what the material is and what you aspire to do with it, and exactly what your motivations are, and also like what your motivations are in this moment. Like, for instance, some people read the quantum book and they don't really engage with the questions because they're kind of just checking it out. They're like, I heard about this quantum thing. Like, what's that all about anyway? They have no desire to, remember all of that material forever. And that's very different from a undergrad who's reading the same thing. And certain types of understanding maybe don't require durable memory. And in fact, it's a little unsettling, but I certainly believe it's possible that you could, for instance, spend a whole bunch of time hanging out with a bunch of people who have certain predilections, and then leave those people behind. And a week later, like, not really remember any of the details of what you discussed. And yet, like, your opinions on a variety of things are probably subtly altered, and your values are probably changed, and so on and so forth. And so that happens.
Yeah. And so how do you think about your own learning? Let's say you were trying to learn a topic like quantum computing or something else. And what are you trying to learn? I'm curious. What do you understand about learning that's different in terms of how you incorporate it for your own? Are you doing sort of, Quizlet or Anki regularly, or what can people learn from the way you learn, or wish you learned if you don't do it?
Sure. So Anki refers to a spaced repetition memory system, which uses some of the same fundamental concepts as quantum country, with, I guess, kind of a different set of metacognitive benefits. We didn't really talk about the metacognitive impact of quantum country's design, so maybe we'll get back to that. Yeah. But so I have an extensive Anki practice. I've been using that for a few years. It's been quite transformative for my life. And yet it is only a part of how I learn. I think the overriding principle of what I'm looking for in approaches to learning is accretion. I want to find activities where when I do the activity, it is not a castle made of sand, which the tide rolls in and washes it away. And it's really interesting to hold that lens up to knowledge worker activities and to see just how many knowledge worker activities are actually really not meaningfully accretive in any way, except insofar as perhaps they leave like, oh, I remember I used that phrase in that conversation with that guy the other day. I'll try that again here. It's very weak. So when I'm learning new things, I write. That's one of the primary ways that I engage. The writing leads to Anki cards usually. That's usually where the good ones come from. Kind of a first pass of spaced repetition questions may just come from direct engagement with the material. And I try to do something with it. I don't really believe in just learning for its own sake. I think that often is quite a distorted activity. I'm not going to get too into that. And so in general, when I'm learning something, it's because I'm trying to do something, and the material that I'm learning is kind of dancing with the environments in which I'm applying it.
Yeah. And so what's an example question that might be in your Anki or?
Here's one from thinking about enhancements to books. I was having a conversation with someone, and an insight appeared in the conversation. The insight was, if I could see who else was reading this, and not only that, but I could also see what spaced repetition questions they created, or perhaps if the author provided them, what their demonstrated retention with those questions was, that creates an interesting new kind of proof of work. It's an interesting new kind of engagement metric. It's a kind of like proof of memory, proof of attention, where, for instance, if I saw some article online is like, Erik has not only read this article and like written some comments that took him 2 seconds. I don't really care about that. But a really strong signal is when Erik wrote this article, he wrote 70 Anki cards and stuck with them and now has 2 months of demonstrated retention with all of those questions. Okay, so that was an insight. That turned into a bunch of Anki cards. So one of them might be, what might someone else's Anki card status on a given topic tell you about their relationship to that topic? And that's not a definition question. That's not a vocabulary word question. That's, to some extent, it's an open-ended question.
Yeah.
And the back of it has a whole bunch of jotted insights. It's not really meant to be, I'm going to hold my thought in any moment against what's on the back of that card. In fact, my hope when I see cards like that is that I think of something stimulated by that impulse that actually isn't captured on the back. And that card there's like a whole bunch of cards that are like that, little prompts. And so on a very surface level, that means that, hey, that was like a useful insight from that conversation. It's not necessarily profound. I'm not going to go off and change what I'm doing based on it, but that kind of thing happens all the time. And it's nice not to lose those things. People want to collect. And so it's a kind of accretion. But it's also a mechanism for making something happen with that insight. It's a kind of programmable attention. And so maybe that's not a terribly actionable idea in that moment. I could decide tomorrow I'm going to schedule some time to pull out my sketchbook and I'm going to do some interface ideas around that, or I'm going to go on Google Scholar and see what's been done there. Neither of those things really feels appropriate. What feels appropriate here is marination. Yeah. And so what's desired is, I just want to return to this in a month and see what new idea I have about it. And this is a way to program myself to do that.
It's funny. I use Twitter for some of those same purposes, just to put ideas out there that I don't want to lose, and sort of an idea journal, and people engaging with it helps me sort of reprompt. I should do some Anki version of that I revisit some of these.
Maybe. Right. So one weird thing I've been playing with is this notional project called Spaced Everything that, this is a context in which I can talk about some of the metacognitive benefits of Quantum Country. So let me introduce that and I'll come back to Spaced Everything in your Twitter observation. Okay. So Quantum Country had a couple of core hypotheses. Maybe it's the case that if you remember all these quantum terms as you're reading more durably, then you'll have an easier time learning quantum material and more people can engage with these ideas seriously. Maybe it's the case that this can be really cheap, like 30% of your original reading time, and you just remember everything forever. And maybe it's the case relative to existing systems like Anki. There's a ton of benefit from interleaving this stuff into the prose. We had a whole bunch of theories about that. Emotional connection, gradually building context, ways that the cards end up less atomized, so on and so forth. A whole bunch of unintended stuff happened, though. So one user interview had a person saying, I read through this one section, and then I was answering the quick questions that came back afterwards, and I realized I didn't remember any of these, and I had just read this material, and I sure thought I was absorbing it. So I stopped and I went back and I read it again. So that's interesting. That's monitoring, and it's filling in for some of the kind of decision-making, executive control. Different people have told us things like, it makes me feel safe. I feel this sense of I'm in good hands. I don't need to stress about, am I going to remember this term or this idea, this process, this concept? Because I just know that, like, as inevitably as a rock rolling down a hill, so long as I like roughly do what the emails tell me to do, for a few minutes, I'm going to know all the stuff endlessly. And I don't really have to think about it. I don't have to plan. And that's a really magical bit of metacognitive scaffolding. And it's something that I think is a broader benefit of spaced repetition systems than just memory. So I know from reading your Twitter that you're familiar with kind of getting things done like practices. One of the core tenets of getting things done is that you got to do these reviews, these triages really regularly, because it needs to be signal, not noise, in order for these systems to successfully allow you to close open loops. And the way that people achieve that is by going through their list regularly, hopefully daily, and making the core decision of getting things done. Or am I going to delegate it? Am I going to defer it? Am I going to drop it? Am I going to do it? These are very discrete actions. What's very interesting about spaced repetition, not for memory, but just for anything, is that it lets you fuzz the edges of how you feel about these things. Mm-hmm. A lot of people simulate this with their email. They'll snooze an email for a day, and then maybe for another day, and then maybe guiltily for a week, and so on and so forth. There's all kinds of interesting emotional stuff happening. To make the decision to drop a task in GTD is pretty hard, and it's one of the big challenges for people to actually maintain their inboxes. To make the decision to defer a task is pretty easy. But unfortunately, it'll just come up again when you deferred it later. So a lot of people will just defer a task for a week, and then it comes up and they defer it for a week. An interesting middle ground for these things and for email is to just say, like, the equivalent of nah. Like, nah, I don't want to. And then it just goes away. And it doesn't go away forever. So it's not the decision to drop. That's a hard decision to make. And nothing is really that certain in the kind of work that we do. It's just like not where I am right now, not with what I'm doing. And then maybe it comes back a week later. And if you say, nah, again, it comes back 2 weeks later. And you say, again, it comes back 2 months later. And eventually it's effectively dropped. But at no point did you make that decision to drop it. So I think it's very interesting to apply this to all kinds of things. I have a system for managing reading inboxes and kind of research questions I'm exploring that works based on these principles. And it's interesting also to apply it to, say, re-engaging in past discussions. Something you found really fruitful, you weren't quite sure what to say. Yeah. Maybe come back in a week. Do you feel like you have something now? Yeah. No?
I remember reading, it was Robert Pirsig's first book or second book, Zen and the Automotive Companions, or Lila, and he talks about how his writing process was he would just write these note cards.
That's in Lila, yeah.
Yeah. And then he would reorganize them.
That's right.
And I think Ryan Holiday or other people have copied that method too. It's sort of a similar process, like online spaced repetition tools. It's a similar process just to see how different things might work differently, but also how they perhaps stimulate the mind.
I find all of these practices super interesting. And in my own creative work, I'm engaging in kind of shape-shifting continuous adaptations of Zettelkasten and the like. And the ways in which they interact with spaced repetition is so interesting. Okay, so there's this core task in these systems, which is that when you add a note to the system, you are obligated, if you follow the process, to connect it to a bunch of other notes. And that instigates a search. So you go off like, I think this one might be connected, maybe that one. You kind of flip through a bunch of stuff. And so you end up rereading these things. And what's cool about it from a comparison to Anki type thing perspective is that it's much more directed. And I don't know about you, but I do end up with kind of stuff I don't really care about sometimes in Anki. And then I have to make this decision to drop it. That's a hard decision, just like we've been discussing, so I don't always do it. It's kind of bad. This technique ensures that the stuff you're looking through is like actually related to what you're caring about. The flip side is that these kind of expanding space repetition systems, they have this exponential character to them that's really essential. Because, I described in Quantum Country, it's like 5 days, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months, etc. Because that's the schedule. It means that my carrying capacity for adding new material every day is super high. I have a constant Anki review time of 10 minutes or less a day. And yet I'm able to maintain thousands of cards in that deck. And I can add, I found, up to about 40 new questions a day before I perturb that. So 40 new questions a day, 365 days a year, that is a lot of new stuff to throw into the system with apparently no limit to my memory. And it depends on that exponential spacing. Whereas by contrast, not only do these node systems not have an exponential spacing character, they actually get more expensive with every note you write, because you have to potentially do a linear search through everything. I don't yet know what to do about that.
So, sort of leaning towards closing here, I want to get a sense for what are your sort of requests for tools of thought. If that's what you're focused on, you and Michael are focused on, where do you see yourself, you two focusing on it? Like what's the next, project or product? And then also if, imagine sort of a hackathon or a sort of, all these talented builders, designers, thinkers were coming to you and saying, hey, we want to work in the space. What else should we do? Like, what's your sort of call to art? What do you want to see people create in the space or see exist?
To your first question, we're kind of using Quantum Country as a bit of a laboratory for experimenting with all kinds of questions around memory systems, attention systems, things like that. So there's a lot of stuff actually ongoing right now there that we're pretty excited about. We have a piece that is upcoming in the next few weeks that will outline a lot of that. We have an essay where we talk about our next projects in somewhat more detail, as well as our philosophy about how we're approaching this and what we think we know about creating transformative tools for thought that maybe others don't, and which tries to answer the question, why has there been so little progress here? So to your question about the hackathons, one of the claims that we make is that the reason that there has been so little progress is that interfaces are as powerful as the ideas which they reify. And if you're a good designer, you can make a more powerful interface that represents some idea, assuming it hasn't already kind of reached the limits of that underlying idea. Certainly you could do this for Anki. Its interface is atrocious in a lot of ways. The underlying idea has some room there. But what's really needed in many of these cases is powerful ideas. And too often the people who are trying to create tools for thought are fixated on the programming or the making the system, whereas it's the thinking about the underlying idea which is being represented, which is actually the differentiating, the challenging, the missing thing in many of these cases. And what's unique about this discipline, the creating of the tools for thought, these systems, is that actually the real insight, the real novelty, it lies in new ideas in this conjoined space between the underlying discipline, which in memory systems you could think of as cognitive science, and system building. So a new thing that is a mnemonic medium is an insight which has new ideas in cognitive science and new ideas in system building. And it's only reachable by someone who is willing to, say, do original research in that underlying discipline, and also to express that research in systems so that they can move those ideas forward in ways which are not accessible to members of that discipline. So a hackathon's not going to do it, is my summary.
Maybe one last question, and if it doesn't go anywhere, that's fine. I'm curious, you spent 5 years at Khan Academy. Yeah. How do you think about the future of education maybe different from how sort of, a sort of mainstream views the future of education, or what's your different idea there?
Okay. The triumph of education in the last 30 years has been raising the floor. If you look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress, boy, the story for African Americans, the story for lower class lower income students. Boy, it's just a wonderful success story. Obviously, there's still tons of disadvantages, but the relative progress for those demographies is just so exciting and fantastic. And that's the work of people in policy, people in technology, teachers on the ground, superintendents, and parents everywhere. What's not moving so much is the other end of the spectrum. I don't really mean like the wealthy people aren't being more successful. It's not a demographic thing at that point. Rather, it's that basically deep understanding of materials. We're not really making much progress there, and I'm not optimistic about education technology as an industry, about learning science as a field, in making a lot of progress there. There's a lot of cultural incentives which I think will make it challenging. I'm presently much more optimistic in trying to help serious people trying to solve serious problems do that, in hopes that insights there will help the upper ends of achievement.
Yeah. I'm curious how you think about the difference between sort of augmenting individual intelligence versus sort of augmenting collective intelligence. And I see your focus being on sort of, individual intelligence, but sort of this idea of, Wikipedia isn't very good relative to what it could be, or, sort of collective wisdom, or, we're all reading and curating and, talking about similar things, but it doesn't seem like we're really building on top of each other in thoughtful ways.
I'm extremely excited about all these topics. I mentioned Scenius earlier. I mentioned Less Wrong earlier. Boy, what an interesting, weird little example. So powerful for this community. I mean, how many millions of dollars have been moved? Like, would effective altruism exist without that very strange little blog? I think, yes, probably. But boy, it would be so different. And at least in the Bay Area, its scope would, I think its scope would be radically different. I don't have great insights here, but I'm very excited about it.
My guest today has been Andy Matuschak. You can follow him on Twitter. Check out his latest piece with Michael Nielsen. And Andy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Erik.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/networkcatalyst.